Hi, I'm about to start. Greetings and welcome. We heard the tink, and I'm about to start. This is Imune Yisrael of Solonamis 101. This particularly is the LEV project, an extension of Take Time to Heal. And this is part 16 of the LEV project. We started on the 1st of January. And, I want to thank everyone who, even if you aren't able and haven't been able to come on the live reading, who took the time to just follow the story. I would really love to hear. I've heard from some people. I would like to hear how the process was for you. Like I said, I just posted on social media, and I'll give everybody a little bit of time to arrive. Some started very shaky. Some was like, I don't want to go any further. Some said, I don't see the reason why we need to talk about this. But for those who continued on, we're celebrating victory today over our fears, over our reservations of going into the narratives. And we actually got beyond that initial phase to begin to digest some of our history. And this is a beautiful thing. I don't know how, if you understand how beautiful it is, but this is a beautiful, beautiful thing. And I am so overjoyed at this moment that we are at through the first, almost through the first. I'm looking forward to see what happens with them. But we're coming to the end of the first one. So beautiful, hallelujah for that one. So we're gonna read, like I said, the end of it. We left off where he is now back after what? I don't know how many months in the wilderness. It was over 8 months. He left in August, and he didn't get there till, what was that? March, end of March, April. And he finally got there. He saw his children, and then he realized, oh wow, what am I gonna do? For those who know exactly not what we're talking about, you might have to go back a few episodes to hear what's going on. But right now, he got a job. His first wife died. He married again, and then he had some more children. And so here we go. This is chapter 19. And just say congratulations. Congratulate. I will do the congratulations at the end. But congratulations, you made it thus far. And we're gonna start another one tomorrow. But let's finish this one right now. Chapter 19. In the month of June 18, as I was plowing in my lot, three gentlemen rode up to me to my fence, and alighting from their horses, all came over the fence and approached me, when one of them told me he was the sheriff and had a writ in his pocket which commanded him to take me to Baltimore. I was not conscious of having done anything injurious to anyone, but yet felt a distrust of these men, who were all strangers to me. I told them I would go with them if they would permit me to turn my oxen loose from the plow, but it was my intention to seek an opportunity of escape into the house of a gentleman who lived about a mile from me. This purpose I was not able to effect, for whilst I was taking the yoke from the oxen, one of the gentlemen came behind me and knocked me down with a heavy whip, and that he carried in his hand. It's popping off in the first paragraph already. When I received from the stunning effects of this, sorry, when I recovered from the stunning effects of this blow, I found myself bound with my hands behind me, strong cords closely wrapped about my arms. In this condition, I was forced to set out immediately for Baltimore without speaking to my wife or entering my door. This is the second time it happened to him. I expected that on arriving at Baltimore, I should be taken before a judge for the purpose of being tried. But in this, I was deceived. They led me to the city jail and there shut me up with several other black people, both men and women, who told me that they had lately been purchased by a trader from Georgia. I now saw the extent of my misfortune, but could not learn who the persons were who had seized me. In the evening, however, one of the gentlemen who had brought me from home came into the jail with the jailer and asked me if I knew him. On being answered in the negative, he told me he knew me very well and asked me if I did not recollect the time when he and his brother had whipped me before my master's door in Georgia. I now recognized the features of the younger and the two brothers of my mistress. But this man was so changed in his appearance from the time when I had last seen him that if he had not declared himself, I should never have known him. When I left Georgia, he was not more than 21 or 22 years of age and had black bushy hair. His hair was now thin and gray, and all his features was changed. They were serious, like this has been many years, okay? After lying in jail a little more than 2 weeks, strongly ironed, my fellow prisoners and I were one day chained together, handcuffed in pairs, and in this way driven about 10 miles out of Baltimore, where we remained all night. On the evening of the second day, we halted in Bladensburg. And he goes again. On the next morning, we marched to Washington, and as we passed in front of the president's house, I saw an old gentleman walking in the grounds near the grate. The gentleman was the president of the United States. Within 4 weeks after we left Washington, I was in Milledgeville in Georgia, near which the man who had kidnapped me resided. He took me home with him and set me to work on his plantation. But I had now enjoyed liberty too long to submit quietly to the endurance of slavery. I had no sooner come here than I began to devise ways of escaping again from the hands of my tyrants and of making my way to the northern states. The month of August was now approaching, which is a favorable season of the year to travel, on account of the abundance of food that is to be found in the cornfields and orchards. But I remembered the dreadful sufferings that I had endured in my former journey from the South, and determined, if possible, to devise some scheme of getting away that would not subject me to such hardships. After several weeks of consideration, I resolved to run away, go to some of the seaports, and endeavor to get a passage on board a vessel bound to a northern city. With this view, I assumed the appearance of resignation and composure under the new aspect of my future, and even went so far as to tell my new master that I lived more comfortably with him in his cotton fields than I had formerly done on my small farm in Maryland, though I believe my master did me the justice to give no credit to my assertions on this subject. From the moment I discovered in Maryland that I had fallen into the hands of the brother of my former mistress, I gave up hope of contesting his right to arrest me with success at law, as I supposed he had come with authority to reclaim me as property of his of his sister. But after I had returned to Georgia and had been at work some weeks on the plantation of my new master, I learned that he now claimed me as his own slave, and that he had reported he had purchased me in Baltimore. It was now clear to me that this man, having by some means learned the place of my residence in Maryland, had kidnapped and now held me as a slave without the color of legal right. But complaint on my part was useless, and resistance vain. I was again reduced to the condition of a common field slave on a cotton plantation in Georgia, and compelled to subsist on the very scanty and coarse food allowed to the Southern slave. I had been absent from Georgia almost 20 years, and in the period, great changes had doubtlessly taken place in the face of the country, as well as in the condition of human society. I had never been in Celidaville until I was brought here by the man who had kidnapped me in Maryland, and I was now a slave among entire strangers, and had no friend to give me consolation of kind words, such as I formerly received from my master in Morgan County. The plantation on which I was now a slave had formerly belonged to the father of my mistress, and some of my fellow slaves had been well acquainted with her in her youth. From these people, I learned that after the death of my master and my flight from Georgia, my mistress had become the second wife of a second husband, who removed with her to the state of Louisiana more than 15 years ago. Oh, because the master had died, if we recollect. The master had died and she seemed to have married again. I'm hearing a little bit of tinking here. Let me check and make sure everything is all good. So the mistress moved to Louisiana, and now they heard the story. So this might be the brother or might not be the brother. I don't know. After ascertaining these facts, which proved beyond all doubt that my present master had no right whatsoever to me, see, it's not the brother, in either law or justice, I determined that before encountering the dangers and suffering that must necessarily attend my second flight from Georgia, I would attempt to proclaim the protection of laws of the country, and try to get myself discharged from the unjust slavery in which I was now held. For this purpose, I went to Maligdeville one Sunday and inquired for a lawyer of a black man whom I met in the street. This person told me that his master was a lawyer and went with me to his house. The lawyer, after talking to me some time, told me that my master was his client and that he therefore could not undertake my case, but referred me to a young gentleman who he said would do my business for me. Accordingly to this young man, I went, and after relating my whole story to him, he told me that he believed he could not do anything for me as I had no witness to prove my freedom. I rejoined that it seemed hard that I must be compelled to prove myself a free man, and that it would appear more constant to reason that my master should prove me to be a slave. He, however, assured me that this was not the law in Georgia, where every man of color was presumed to be a slave until he could prove that he was free. He then told me that if I expected him to talk to me, I must give him a fee, whereupon I gave him all the money I had been able to procure since my arrival in the country, which was $2.75. When I offered him this money, the lawyer tossed his head and said such a trifle was not worth accepting, but nevertheless he took it, and then asked if I could get some more money before the next Sunday. That if I could get another dollar, he would issue a writ and have me brought before the court. But if he succeeded in getting me set free, I must engage to serve him a year. To this condition I agreed and signed a paper which the lawyer wrote, which was signed by two persons as witness. So the lawyer gonna get him free only to work for him as an indentured servant. The brother of my pretended master was yet living in this neighborhood, and the lawyer advised me to have him brought forward as a witness to prove that I was not the slave of my present pretended owner. On the Wednesday following my visit to Meldeville, hope I'm saying that right, the sheriff came to my master's plantation and took me from the field to the house, telling me as I walked beside him that he had a writ which commanded him to take me to Meldeville. Instead, however, of obeying the command of the writ, when he arrived at the house, he took a bond of my master that he would produce me at the courthouse on the next day, Friday, and then rode away, leaving me at the mercy of my kidnapper. That was law enforcement. Since I had been on this plantation, I had never been whipped, although all the other slaves, of whom there were more than 50, were frequently flogged without any apparent cause. I had all along attributed my exemption from the lash of fear of my master. He knew I had formerly run away from his sister on account of her cruelty and his own savage conduct to me, and I believed that he was still apprehensive that a repetition of his former barbarity might produce the same effect that it had done 20 years before. His evil passions were like fire covered with ashes, concealed, not extinguished. He now found that I was determined to try to regain my liberty at all events. And the sheriff was no sooner gone than the overseer was sent for to come from the field. And I was tied up and whipped with the long lashed Negro whip until I fainted and was carried in a state of insensibility to my lodgings in the quarter. It was night when I recovered my understanding sufficiently to be aware of my true situation. I now found that my wounds had been oiled and that I was wrapped in a piece of linen cloth, but for several days I was unable to leave my bed. When Friday came, I was not taken to Meldeville, and afterwards learned that my master reported to the court that I had been taken ill and was not able to leave the house. The judge asked no questions as to the cause of my illness. At the end of 2 weeks, I was taken to Meldeville and carried before a judge who first asked a few questions of my master as to the length of time that he had owned me and the place where he had purchased me. He stated in my presence that he purchased me with several others at a public auction in the city of Baltimore and had paid $510 for me. I was not permitted to speak to the court, much less to contradict his falsehood in the manner it deserved. The brother of my master was then called as a witness by my lawyer, but the witness refused to be sworn or examined on account of his interest in me as his slave. In support of his refusal, he produced a bill of sale from my master to himself for an equal undivided half part of the slave. The bill of sale was dated several weeks previous to the time of the trial and gave rise to an argument between the opposing lawyers that continued until the court adjourned in the evening. On the next morning, I was again brought into the court, and the judge now delivered his opinion, which was that the witness could not be compelled to give evidence in a case to which he was really, though not nominally, a party. The court then proceeded to give judgment in the case now before it and declared that the law was well settled in Georgia, that every Negro was presumed to be a slave until he proved his freedom by the dearest evidence. That where a Negro was found in the custody of keeping of a white man, the law declared that white man to be his master without any evidence of the subject. Woohoo! But the case before the court was exceedingly plain and free from all doubt or difficulty. Here the master was brought his slave into the state of Georgia as his property, has held him as a slave ever since, and still holds him as a slave. The title of the master in this case is best title that a man can have to any property, and the order of the court is that the slave be returned to the custody of his master. I was immediately ordered to return home, and from this time until I left the plantation, my life was a continual torment to me. The overseer often came up to me in the field and gave me several lashes with his long whip over my naked back, through mere wantonness, and I was often compelled, after I had done my day's work in the field, to cut wood or perform some other labor at the house until long after dark. My sufferings were too great to be borne long by any human creature, and to a man who had once tasted the sweets of liberty, they were doubly tormented. There was nothing in the form of danger that could intimidate me. If the road on which I had to encounter it led me to freedom, no, if the road on which I had to encounter it led me to freedom. That's what it said. Okay, that season of the year most favorable to my escape from bondage had at length arrived. The corn in the fields was so far grown as to be fit for roasting. The peaches were beginning to ripen. Sweet potatoes were large enough to be eaten. But notwithstanding all of this, the difficulties that surrounded me were greater than can easily be imagined by anyone who has never been a slave in the lower country of Georgia. Georgia is a long state, by the way, a really long state if he's deep in the South. My goodness. In the first place, I was almost naked, having no other clothes than a ragged shirt of tow cloth, a pair of old trousers of the same material, with an old woolen jacket that I had brought with me from home. In addition to this, I was closely watched every evening until I had finished the labor assigned to me, and then I was locked up in a small cabin by myself for the night. The cabin was really a prison and had been built for the purpose of confining such of the slaves of this estate as were tried in the evening and sentenced to be whipped in the morning. It was built of strong oak log, hewn square and dovetailed together at the corners. It had no window in it, but as the logs did not fit very close together, there were never any want of air in this jail, in which I had been locked up every night since my trial before the court. On Sundays, I was permitted to go to work in the fields with the other people who worked on that day, if I chose so to do. But at this time, I was put under the charge of an old African Negro who was instructed to give me immediate information if I attempt to leave the field. No, he was instructed to give immediate information if I attempted to leave the field. To escape on Sunday was impossible, and there seemed to be no hope of getting out of my sleeping room, the floor of which was made of strong pine plank. Fortune at length did for me that which I had not been able to accomplish by the greatest efforts for myself. The lock that was on the door of my nightly prison was large stock lock and had been clumsily fitted on the door, so that the end of the lock pressed against the door case and made it difficult to shut the door even in dry weather. When the weather was damp and the wood was swollen with moisture, it was not easy to close the door at all. Late in the month of September, the weather became cloudy and much rain fell. The clouds continued to obscure the heavens 4 or 5 days. One evening, when I was ordered to my house, as it was called, the overseer followed me without a light, although it was very dark. When I was in the house, he pushed the door after me with all his strength. The violence of the effort caused the door to pass within the case at the top, for 1 or 2 feet, and this held it so fast that he could not again pull it open. Supposing in the extreme darkness that the door was shut, he turned the key, and the bolt of the lock passed on the outside of the staple intended to receive it. Completely deceived him. He then withdrew the key and went away. Soon after he was gone, I went to the door and, feeling with my hands, ascertained that it was not shut. An opportunity now presented itself for me to escape from my prison house, with the prospect of being able to be so far from my master's residence before morning that none could soon overtake me, even should the course of my flight be ascertained. Waiting quietly until everyone about the quarter had ceased to be heard, I applied one of my feet to the door and, giving it a strong push, forced it open. The world was now before me, but the darkness was so profound as to obscure from my vision the largest objects, even a house at the distance of a few yards. But dark as it was, necessity compelled me to leave the plantation without delay. And knowing only the great road that led to Milledgeville, that's a wild place, amongst the various roads of this country, I set off a brisk walk on the public highway, assured that no one could apprehend me in so a dark night. It was only about 7 miles in Milledgeville when I when I reached that town. Several lights were burning in the windows of houses, but keeping on directly through the village, I neither saw nor heard any person in it. After gaining the open country, my first care was to find some secure place where shelter could be found for the next day. But no appearance of thick woods was to be seen for several miles, and 2 or 3 hours must have elapsed before a forest of sufficient magnitude was found to answer my purpose. It was perhaps 3 o'clock in the morning when I took refuge in a thick and dismal swamp that lay on the right hand of the road, intending to remain here until daylight and then look out for a secret place to conceal myself in during the day. Hitherto, although the night was so extremely dark, it had not rained any, but soon after my halt in the swamp, the rain began to fall in floods, rather than in showers, which made me as wet as if I had swam a river. Daylight at length appeared, but brought with it very little mitigation of my sufferings, for the swamp in which my hiding place was lay in the midst of a well-peopled city. I'm reading what's not there. Lay in the midst of a well-peopled country, and was surrounded on all sides by cotton and cornfields, so close to me that the open spaces of the cleared land could be seen from a position. It was dangerous to move lest someone should see me, and painful to remain without food when hunger was consuming me. My resting place in the swamp was within a view of the road, and soon after sunrise, although it continued to rain fast, numerous horsemen were seen passing along the road by the way that had led me to the swamp. There was little doubt on my mind that these people were in search of me, and the sequel proved that my surmises were well founded. It rained throughout this day, and the fear of being apprehended by those who came in pursuit of me confined me to the swamp until after dark the following evening, when I ventured to leave the thicket and return to the high road, the bearing of which it was impossible for me to ascertain on account of the dense clouds that obscured the heavens. All that could be done in my situation was to take care not to follow that end of the road which led me to the swamp. Turning my back once more upon Milledgeville and walking a quick pace, every effort was made to remove myself as far as possible this night from the scene of suffering, from which that swamp will always memorably in my mind. The rain had ceased to fall at the going down of the sun, and the darkness of this second night was not so great as the first had been. This circumstance was regarded by me as a happy presage of the final success that awaited my undertaking. Events proved that I was no prophet, for the dim light of this night was the cause of the sad misfortune that awaited me. Oh boy. Hold on. The rain had ceased to fall at the going down of, I read that, sorry. In a former part of this volume, the reader is made acquainted with the deep interest that is taken by all the planters far and wide around the plantation from which a slave has escaped by running away. 20 years had wrought no change in favor of the fugitive, nor had the feuds and dissensions that agitate and distract the communities of white men produce any relaxation in the friendship that they profess to feel and really do feel for each other on question of so much importance to them all. More than 20 miles of road had been left behind me this night, and it must have been 2 or 3 in the morning when I was passing a part of the road that led through a dense pine grove where the trees on either side grew close to the wheel tracks. 5 or 6 men suddenly rushed upon me from both sides of the road with loud cries of "Kill him! Kill him!" accompanied with oaths of, what is this? Opprobrious language, seized me, dragged me to the ground, and bound me fast with a long cord, which was wrapped round my arms and body so as to confine my hands below my hips. In this condition, I was driven, or rather dragged, about 2 miles to a kind of tavern or public house that stood by the side of the road, where my captors were joined soon after daylight by at least 20 of their companions, who had been out all night waiting and watching for me on the other roads of this part of the country. Those who had taken me were loudly applauded by their fellows, and whole party passed this morning in drinking and singing songs and playing at this house. At breakfast time, they gave me a large cane of cornbread and some sour milk for breakfast. About 10 o'clock in the morning, my master arrived at the tavern in company with 2 or 3 other gentlemen, all strangers to me. My master, when he came into my presence, looked at me and said, "Well, you had bad luck in running away this time," and immediately asked aloud what any person would give for me. One man who was lightly intoxicated said he would give $400 for me. Others bid followed until my price was soon up to $580, for which I was stricken off by my master himself to a gentleman who immediately gave his note for me and took charge of me as his property. Woo! We got one more chapter. This thing is looking grim. I mean, he bring you right up to the end of this. For those who've just joined us, this is 50 Years in Chains. Yeah. This is a cliffhanger, as they say, huh? So we're about to go to chapter 20. Let me take a drink. Dude tried to run away again. He didn't make it out of Georgia. They caught him. And the slave master, that's not even the pretend slave master, because he stole them, sold them for $580. The name of my new master was Jones, a planter who was only a visitor in this part of the country, his residence being about 50 miles down the country. The next day, my new master set off with me to the place of his residence, permitting me to walk behind him as he rode on horseback and leaving me entirely unshackled. I was resolved that as my owner treated me with such much liberty, the trust he reposed in me should not be broken until after we reached his home. Though the determination of again running away and attempting to escape from Georgia never abandoned me for a moment. The country through which we passed on our journey was not rich. The soil was sandy, light, and many places much exhausted by excess tillage. The timber in the woods where the ground was high was almost exclusively pine, but my swamps and extensive tracts of low ground intervened, in which maple, gum, and all other trees common to such land in the South abounded. No improvement in the condition of the slaves on the plantation was here perceptible, but it appeared to me that there was now even a greater want of good clothes amongst the slaves on the various plantations that we passed than had existed 20 years before. Everywhere the overseer still kept up the same custom of walking in the fields with the long whip that has been elsewhere described, and everywhere the slaves proved by the husky appearance of their skin and the dry, sunburnt aspect of their hair that they were strangers to animal food. On the second day of our journey in the evening, we arrived at the residence of my master about 80 miles from Savannah. Oh, he in North Georgia now. The plantation, which had now become the place of my residence, was not large, containing only about 300 acres of cleared land and having on it about 30 working slaves of all classes. It was now I gotta write that down, slave classes. Sorry. It was now the very midst of the season of it was now the very midst of the season of picking cotton, and at the end of 20 years from the time of my first flight, I again had a daily task assigned me, with the promise of half a cent for all the cotton I should pick beyond my day's work. Picking cotton, like every other occupation, required active manipulation, depends more upon sleight than strength, and I was not now able to pick so much in a day as once able to do. My master seemed to be a man ardent bent on the acquisition of wealth, and came into the field where we were at work almost every day, frequently remonstrating in strong language with the overseer because he did not got more work done. Okay, that sounds crazy. Because he didn't get more work done. Our rations on this place were half a peck of corn per week, in addition to which we had rather more than a peck of sweet potatoes allowed to each person. Our provisions were distributed to us every Sunday morning by the overseer, but my master was generally present either to see what justice was done to us or what just injustice was not done to himself. When I had been here about a week, my master came into the field one day, and in passing near me stood and told me that I had now fallen into good hands, as it was his practice not to whip his people much, that he in truth never whipped them, nor suffered his overseer to whip them, except in flagrant cases, that he had discovered a mode of punishment more mild, and at the same time much more effective than flogging, and that he governed his negroes excessively under the mode of discipline. He then told me that when I came home in the evening, I must go to the house, and that he would then make me acquainted with the principles on which he chastised his slaves. Oh, come, let you see how I deal with you. Wow. Going to the house in the evening, according to the orders, my master showed me a pump set in a well in which the water rose within 10 feet of the surface of the ground. The spout of this pump was elevated at least 13 feet above the earth, and when the water was to be drawn from it, the person who worked the handle ascended by a ladder to the proper station. The water in this well, although so near to the surface, was very cold, and the pump discharged it in a large stream. One of the women employed in the house had committed some offense for which she was to be punished, and the opportunity was embraced of exhibiting to me the effect of this novel mode of torture upon the human frame. The woman was stripped quite naked and tied to a post that stood just under the stream of water as it fell from the spout of the pump. A lad was then ordered to ascend the ladder and pump water upon the head and shoulders of the victim, who had not been under the water for more than a minute before she began to cry and scream in a most lamentable manner. In a short time, she exerted her strength in the most convulsive throes in trying to escape from the post. But as the cords were strong, this was impossible. After another minute or a little more, her cries became weaker, and soon afterwards, her head fell forward upon her breast, and then the boy was ordered to cease pumping the water. It's like some torture waterboarding stuff. What in the world? The woman was removed in a state of insensibility, but recovered her faculties in about an hour. The next morning, she complained of lightness of head, but was able to go to work. The punishment of the pump, as it is called, was never inflicted on me, and I was only able to describe it as has been described to me by those who have endured it. When the water first strikes the head and arms, it is not at all painful, but in a very short time, it produces a sensation that is felt with heavy blows are inflicted with large rods of the size of a man's finger. But the perception becomes more and more painful until the skull bone and shoulder blade appears to be broken in pieces. Finally, all the faculties become oppressed. Breathing becomes more and more difficult until the eyesight becomes dim and animation ceases. This punishment is in fact a temporary murder, as all the pains are endured that can be felt by a person who is deprived of life by being beaten with bludgeon. But after the punishment of the pump, the sufferer is restored to existence by being laid in a bed and covered with warm clothes. A giddiness of head, oppression of the breast, followed this operation for a day or two, and sometimes longer. The object of calling me to witness of this new mode of torture, doubtlessly, was to intimidate me from running away. But like medicines administered by empirics, the spectacle had precisely the opposite effect from that which it was expected to produce. After my arrival in this estate, my intention had been to defer my elopement until the next year, before I had seen the torture in guided on this unfortunate woman. But from that moment, my resolution was unalterably fixed to escape as quickly as possible. Such was my desperation of feeling at this time that I deliberated seriously upon the project of endeavoring to make my way southward for the purpose of joining the Indians in Florida. Fortune reserved a more agreeable fate for me. On the Saturday night after the woman was punished at the pulp, I stole a yard of cotton bagging from the cotton gin house and converted it into a big bag. Sorry, where am I seeing? I'm seeing stuff here, people. And converted it into a bag by means of a coarse needle and thread that I borrowed of one of the black women. On the next morning, when our weekly ration was distributed to us, my portion was carefully placed in my bag under pretense of fears that it would be stolen from me if it was left upon the loft of the kitchen that I lodged in. This day being Sunday, I did not go to the field to work as usual on that day, but under presence of being unwell, remained in the kitchen all day, to be better prepared for the toils of the following night. After daylight had totally disappeared, taking my bag under my arm, under pretense of going to the mill to grind my corn, I stole softly across the cotton fields to the nearest woods, and taking an observation of stars, directed my course to the eastward, resolved that in no event should anything induce me to travel a single yard on the high road until at least 100 miles from this plantation. One moment, please. So he's run off once more again. Give me 1 second and I'll be right with you. I hear a bit of babies. So be right with me and I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. Thank you for your patience. And we are here. He has stolen away softly across the cotton fields. It says here, keeping on steadily through the whole of this night and meeting with no swamps or briary thicket in my way, I have no doubt that before daylight, the plantation was more than 30 miles behind me. 20 years before this, I had been in Savannah and noted at that time that great number of ships were in that port, taking in and loading cotton. My plan was now to reach Savannah in the best way I could, by some means to be devised after my arrival in the city, to procure a passage to some of the northern cities. When day appeared before me, I was in a large cotton field, and before the woods could be reached, it was gray dawn. But the forest bordered on the field was large and afforded me good shelter through the day, under the cover of a large thicket of swamp laurel that lay at the distance of a quarter of a mile from the field. It now became necessary to kindle a fire, for all my stock of provisions consisted of corn and potatoes was raw and undressed. Less fortunate now than in my former flight, no fire apparatus was in my possession, and driven at last to the extremity, I determined to endeavor to produce fire by rubbing two sticks together, and spent at least 2 hours of incessant toil in this vain operation, without the least prospect of success. Abandoning this project at length, I turned my thoughts to searching for a stone of some kind, with which to endeavor to extract fire from an old jackknife that had been my companion in Maryland for more than 3 years. My labors were fruitless. No stone could be found in this swamp, and the day was passed in anxiety and hunger, a few raw potatoes being my only food. Night at length came, and with it a renewal of my traveling labors. Avoiding with the utmost care every appearance of a road, and pursuing my way until daylight, I must have traveled at least 30 miles this night. A while before day, in crossing a field, I fortunately came upon a bed of large pebbles on the side of a hill. Several of these were deposited in my bag, which enabled me, when day arrived, to procure fire. How much of us know how to make some fire with some pebbles? We better learn something. With which I parched corn and roasted potatoes sufficient to subsist me for 2 or 3 days. On the 4th night of my journey, fortune directed me to a broad open highway that appeared to be much traveled. Near the side of this road, I established my quarter for the day in a thick pine wood, for the purpose of making observation upon the people who traveled it, and of judging thence of the part of the country to which it led. Soon after daylight, a wagon passed along drawn by oxen and loaded with bales of cotton, then followed some white men on horseback. And soon after sunrise, a whole train of wagons and carts, all loaded with bales of cotton, passed by. Following the wagon first seen by me, in the course of the day, at least 100 wagons and carts passed along this road towards the southeast, all laden with cotton bales, and at least an equal number came toward the west, either laden with casks of various dimensions or entirely empty. Numerous horsemen, many carriages, and great numbers of persons on foot also passed to and fro this road on the course of the day. All these indications satisfy me that I must be near some large town, the seat of an extensive cotton market. The next consideration with me was to know how far it was to this town, for which purpose I determined to travel on the road the succeeding night. Lying in the woods until 11 o'clock, I rose, came to the road, and traveled until within an hour of daylight, at which time the country around me appeared almost wholly clear of timber, and houses became more numerous than they had been in the former part of my journey. Things continued to wear this aspect until daylight, when I stopped and sat down by the side of a high fence that stood beside the road. After remaining here a short time, a wagon laden with cotton passed, drawn by oxen, whose driver, a black man, asked me if I was going towards town. Being answered in the affirmative, he asked me if I did not wish to ride in his wagon. I told him I had been out of town all night and should be very thankful to him for a ride. At the same time, ascending his wagon and placing myself in secure and easy position on the bags of cotton. In this manner, we traveled on for about 2 hours when we entered the town of Savannah. In my situation, there was no danger of anyone suspecting me to be a runaway slave, for no runaway had ever been known to flee from the country and seek refuge in Savannah. The man who drove the wagon passed through several of principal streets of the cities and stopped his team before a large warehouse standing on a wharf looking into the river. Here I assisted my new friend to unload his cotton, and when we were done, he invited me to share his breakfast with him, consisted of cornbread, roast potato, and some boiled rice. Whilst we were at our breakfast, a black man came along the street and asked if we knew where he could hire a hand to help him to work a day or two. I at once replied that my master had sent me to town to hire myself out for a few weeks, and that I was ready to go with him immediately. The joy I felt at finding employment so overcame me that all thought of my wages were forgotten. Bidding farewell to the man who had given me my breakfast and thanking him in my heart for his kindness, I followed my new employer, informed me that he had engaged to remove 1,000 bales of cotton from a large warehouse to the end of a wharf at which a ship lay that was taking in the cotton as a load. This man was a slave, but hired his time of his master at $250 a year, which he paid in monthly installments. He did what he called job work, which consisted of undertaking jobs and hiring men to work under him, if the job was too great to be performed by himself. In the present instance, he had 7 or 8 black men beside me, all hired to help him to remove the cotton in wheelbarrows and lay it near the end of the wharf, when it was taken up by sailors and carried on board the ship that was receiving it. We continued working hard all day, and amongst the crew of ship was a black man with whom I resolved to become acquainted by some means. Accordingly, at night, after we had quit our work, I went to the end of the wharf against which the ship lay moored and stood there a long time, waiting for the black sailor to make his appearance on deck. At length, my desires were gratified. He came upon the deck and sat down near the main mast with a pipe in his mouth, which he was smoking with great apparent pleasure. After a few minutes, I spoke to him, for he had not yet seen me as it appeared, and when he heard my voice, rose up and came to the side of the ship where I stood. We entered into conversation together, in the course of which he informed me that his home was in New York and that he had a wife and several children there, but that he followed the sea for a livelihood and knew no other mode of life. He also asked me where my master lived and if Georgia had always been the place of my residence. I deemed this a favorable opportunity of electing the object I had in view. In seeking the acquaintance of this man, I told him at once that by law and justice I was a free man, but had been kidnapped near Baltimore, forcibly brought to Georgia, and sold there as a slave. That I was now a fugitive from my master and in search of some means of getting back to my wife and children. The man seemed moved by an account of my sufferings, and at the close of my narrative told me he could not receive me on board the ship, as the captain had given positive orders to him not to let any of the Negroes of Savannah come on board, lest they should steal something belonging to the ship. He further told me that he was on watch and should continue on dock 2 hours, that he was forced to take a turn of watching the ship every night for 2 hours, but that his turn would not come the next night until after midnight. I now begged him to enable me to secrete myself on board the ship previous to the time of her sailing, so that I might be conveyed to Philadelphia, where the ship was bound with a load of cotton. He at first received my application with great coldness and said he would not do anything contrary to the orders of his captain. But before we parted, he said he should be glad to assist me if he could, but the execution of the plan proposed by me would attend with great danger, if not ruin. In my situation, there was nothing too hazardous for me to undertake, and I informed him that if he would let me hide myself in the hold of the ship amongst the bags of cotton, no one should ever know that he had any knowledge of the fact, and that all the danger and all the disaster that might attend the affair should fall exclusively on me. He finally told me to go away and that he would think of the matter until the next day. It was obvious that his heart was softened in my favor, that his feelings of compassion almost impelled him to do an act in my behalf that was forbidden by his judgment and his sense of duty to his employers. As the houses of the city was now closed and I was a stranger in the place, I went to a wagon and stood in front of the warehouse and had been unladen of cotton that had been brought in it, and creeping into it, made my bed with the driver, who permitted me to share his lodgings among some corn tops that he had brought to feed his oxen. When the morning came, I went again to the ship, and when the people came on dock, asked them or the captain, whom I should not have known by his dress, which were very similar to that of sailors. On being asked if he did not wish to hire a hand to help load his ship, he told me I might go to work amongst the men if I chose, and he would pay me what I was worth. My object was to procure employment on the ship. My object was to procure employment on board the ship and not to get wages. And in the course of the day, I found means to enter the hold of the ship several times and examine it minutely. The black sailor promised that he would not betray me, and that if I could find the means of escaping on board the ship, he would not disclose it. At the end of 3 days, the ship had taken in her loading, and the captain said in my presence that he intended to set sail the day after. No time was now to be lost, and asking the captain what he thought I had earned, he gave me $3, which was certainly very liberal pay, considering that during the whole time that I had worked for him, my fare had been the same as that of sailors, who had as much as they could consume of excellent food. The sailors were now busy in trimming the ship and making ready for sea, and observing that this work required them to spend much time in the hold of the ship, I went to the captain and told him that as he had paid me good wages and treated me well, I would work with his people the residue of this day for my victuals and half a gallon of molasses, which he said he would give me. My first object now was to get into the hold of the ship with those who were adjusting the cargo. The first time the men below called for aid, I went to them, and being there, took care to remain with them. Being placed at one side of the hold for purposes of packing the bags close to the ship's timbers, I also managed as to leave a space between two of the bags large enough for a man to creep in and conceal himself. This cavity was near the opening in the center of the hold that was left to let men down to stow away the last of the bags that were put in. In this small hollow retreat among the bags of cotton, I determined to take my passage to Philadelphia if by any means I could succeed in stealing on board the ship at night. It's about to get on and popping. We only have two more pages. When the evening came, I went to a store near the wharf and bought 2 jugs, one that held half a gallon, and the other a large stone jug holding more than 3 gallons. When it was dark, I filled my large gallon with water, purchased 20 pounds of pilot bread at a bakery, which I tied in a large handkerchief, and taking my jugs in my hand, went on board the ship to receive my molasses of the captain for the labor of the day. The captain was not on board, and a boy gave me the molasses. But under pretense of waiting to see the captain, I sat down between two rows of cotton bales that were stowed on deck. The night was very dark, and watching a favorable opportunity, when the men on deck had gone forward, I succeeded in placing both my jugs upon the bags of cotton that rose in the hold, almost to the deck. In another moment, I glided down amongst the cargo, and lost no time in placing my jugs in the place provided for them amongst the bales of cotton, besides the layer provided for myself. Soon after I had taken my station for the voyage, the captain came on board, and the boy reported to him that he had paid me off and dismissed me. In a short time, all was quiet on board and the ship, except the occasional tread of men on watch. I slept none at all this night. The anxiety that oppressed me prevented me from taking any repose. Before day, the captain was on deck and gave orders to the seamen to clear the ship for sailing, and to be ready to descend the river with the ebb tide, which was expected to flow at sunrise. I felt the motion of the ship when she got under way, and thought the time long before I heard the breakers of the ocean surging against her sides. For those who just joined us, we're reading the last chapter of 50 Years in States in Chains. He's escaped. He's stowed away on a ship. Let's see what happens. In the place where I lay, when the hatches were closed, total darkness prevailed, and I had no idea of the lapse of time or the progress we made, until, having at one period crept out into the open space between the rows of cotton bags, which I had before described, I heard a man, who appeared from the sound of the voice to be standing on the hatch, call out and say, "This is Cape Hatteras." I had already come out of my covert several times into the open space, but the hatches were closed so tightly as to exclude all light. It appeared to me that we had already been at sea a long time, but as darkness was unbroken with me, I could not make any computations of periods. Soon after this, the hatch was opened and light was let into the hold. A man descended for the purpose of examining the state of the cargo, who returned in a short time. The hatch was again closed, and nothing of moment occurred from this time, until I heard and felt the ship strike against some solid body. In a short time, I heard much noise and multitude of sounds of various kinds. All this satisfied me that the ship was in some port, for I no longer heard the sound of waves, nor perceived the least motion in the ship. At length the hatch was again opened, and the light was let in upon me. My anxiety now was to escape from the ship without being discovered by anyone, to accomplish which I determined to issue from the hold as soon as night came on. If possible, waiting until sometime after daylight had disappeared, I ventured to creep to the hatchway and raise my head above deck. Seeing no one on board, I crawled out of the hold and stepped on board a ship that lay alongside of that in which rewind. Seeing no one on board, I crawled out of the hold and stepped on board a ship that lay alongside of that in which I had come a passenger. Here a man seized me and called me a thief, saying I had come to rob his ship, and it was with much difficulty that I prevailed upon him to let me go. He at length permitted me to go on the wharf, and I once more felt myself a free man. I did not know what city I was in, but as the sailors had told me at Savannah that their ship was bound to Philadelphia, I had no doubt of being in that city. And going along the street, a black man met me, and I asked him if I was in Philadelphia. The question caused the stranger to laugh loudly, and he passed on without giving me an answer. Soon afterwards, I met an old gentleman with drab clothes on, and I could see by the light of the lamps. To him I propounded the same question that had been addressed a few moments before the black man. This time, however, I received a civil answer, being told that I was in Philadelphia. The gentleman seemed concerned for me, either because of my wretched and ragged appearance, or because I was a stranger and did not know where I was. Whether for one cause or the other, I knew not, but he told me to follow him and led me to the house of a black man not far off, whom he directed to take care of me until the morning. In this house I was kindly entertained all night, and when the morning came, the old gentleman in drab clothes returned and brought with him an entire suit of clothes, not more than half worn, and of which he made me a present and gave me money to buy a hat and some mousseline for a couple of shirts. He then turned now to go to work for thy living. No. He then turned to go away and said, I perceive that thee is a slave and has run away from your master. They can now go to work for your living, but take care that you do not catch thee again, that they do not catch you again. I then told him that I had been a slave and had twice run away and escaped from the state of Georgia. The gentleman seemed a little incredulous, of which I told him, but when I explained to him that the cause of the condition in which he found me, he seemed to become more than interested in my fate. The gentleman, whose name I shall not publish, has always been a kind friend to me. After remaining in Philadelphia a few weeks, I resolved to return to my little farm in Maryland for the purpose of selling my property for as much as it would produce and of bringing my wife and children to Pennsylvania. On arriving in Baltimore, I went to a tavern keeper who I had formerly supplied with vegetables for my garden. This man was greatly surprised to see me and asked me how I managed to escape from my master in Georgia. I told him that the man who had taken me to Georgia was not my master, but had kidnapped me and carried me away by violence. The tavern keeper then told me that I had better leave Baltimore as soon as possible and showed me a handbill that was stuck up against the wall of his bar room in which $150 reward was offered for my apprehension. I immediately left his house and fled from Baltimore that very night. When I reached my former residence, I found a white man living in it whom I did not know. This man, on being questioned by me as to the time he owned this place, the manner in which he had obtained possession, informed me that a black man had formerly lived here, but he was a runaway slave and his master had come the summer before and carried him off. The wife of the former owner of the house was also a slave, and that her master had come about 6 weeks before the present and taken her and her children and sold them to Baltimore. And sold them in Baltimore to a slave dealer from the South. This man also informed me that he was not in this neighborhood at the time the woman and her children were carried away, but that he received the information from a black woman who lived a mile off. Man, we got one page and a little bit to go, and this story is still looking crazy. The black woman I was well acquainted with, she had been my neighbor, and I knew her to be my friend. She had been set free some years before by a gentleman of this neighborhood and resided under his protection on part of his land. I immediately went to the house of this woman, who could scarcely believe the evidence of her eyes. When she saw me enter her door, the words she spoke to me were, Lucy and her children have all been stolen away. At my request, she gave me the following account of the manner in which my wife and children, all of whom had been free from their birth, were seized and driven into Southern slavery. A few weeks, said she, after they took you away, and before Lucy had so far recovered from the terror produced by that event as to remain in her house all night with her children without some other company, I went one evening to stay all night with her, a kindness that I always rendered her if no other person came to remain with her. It was late when we went to bed, perhaps 11 o'clock, and after we had been asleep some time, we were awakened by a loud rap at the door. At first we said nothing, but upon the rap being several times repeated, Lucy asked who was there. She was then told in a voice that seemed by its sound to be that of a woman to get up and open the door, adding that the person without had something to tell her that she wished to hear. So Lucy, supposing the voice to be that of a black woman, the slave of a lady living near, rose and opened the door. But to our astonishment, instead of a woman coming in, 4 or 5 men rushed into the house and immediately closed the door, at which one of the men stood with his back against it until the others made a light in the fireplace and proceeded liberally to tie Lucy with a rope. Search was then made in the bed for the children, and I was found and dragged out. This seemed to produce some consternation among the captors, whose faces were all black, but whose hair and visages were those of white men. They was in blackface stealing people. A constellation was held among them, the object of which was to determine whether I should also be taken along with Lucy and the children or be left behind on account of the interest which my master was supposed to feel for me. This is the woman telling the story. That's why she's saying in the first person. It was finally agreed that as it would be very dangerous to carry me off lest my old master should cause pursuit to be made after me, they would leave me behind and take only Lucy and the children. One of the number, they said it would not do to leave me behind, and at liberty I would immediately go and give intelligence of what I had seen. And if the affair should be discovered by the member of the Abolition Society before they had time to get out of Maryland, they would certainly be detected and punished for the crimes they were committed. It was finally resolved to tie me with cords to one of the logs of the house, gag me by tying a rope in my mouth, and confining it closely to the back of my neck. They immediately confined me and then took the children from the bed. The oldest they tied to his mother and compelled them to go out of the house together. Okay. The three youngest children were then taken out of bed and carried off in the hands of men who tied me to the log. I never saw nor heard any more of Lucy or her children. For myself, I remained in the house, the door of which was carefully closed and fastened after it was shut, until the second night after my confinement, without anything to eat or drink. On the second night, some unknown persons came and cut the cords that bound me when I returned to my own cabin. We got two more paragraphs to go. And yeah, let's see. This intelligence almost deprived me of life. It was the most dreadful of all the misfortunes that I had ever suffered. It was now clear that some slave dealer had come in my absence and seized my wife and children as slaves and sold them to such men as I have served in the South. They had now passed into hopeless bondage and were gone forever beyond my reach. I myself was advertised as a fugitive and was liable to be arrested at each moment and dragged back to Georgia. I rushed out of my own house to despair and returned to Pennsylvania with a broken heart. For the last few years, last paragraph. For the last few years, I have resided about 50 miles from Philadelphia, where I expected to pass the evening of my life in working hard for my substance, without the least hope of ever again seeing my wife and children. Fearful at this day to let my place of residence be known, lest even yet it may be supposed that as an article of property, I am of sufficient value to be worth pursuing in my old age. The end. Congratulations. We have made it through and given voice back to the story and the heritage of one Charles Ball, 50 years in chains, the life of an American slave. Wow. I wish I could hear your feedback right now. You can definitely put it under this video. Sorry for all the tongue twisters. I need to slow down a little bit. I'm so excited when I'm reading. You know, I'm reading and trying to process at the same time. So it's you know, it's a little difficult. So definitely I'll slow down on my reading because I'm tripping up on some words because it's really engaging. But wow. Wow. Whew. A lot of times these slave narratives, as they're writing them, to what I studied and learned, they were writing in a time where abolition was high. And that's why we heard at the end, as the neighbor was recounting her story, the abolitionist was moving and things was high. And so they would write these narratives to the people who were against slavery so that they would get an understanding of the life that they were living, and they would further pursue the abolition of slavery. And so you will see, if you begin to look at, and there was a good thing on PBS, I think I'll find a link. It's called The Abolitionist. I don't know if you saw it. It's like a 3-part series, and they show you about abolition of slavery and how it was Europeans as well as free black quote unquote black people who were pushing for this. So narratives such as this and the one that we're going to read also, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, they were written to that audience of that day and time to give voice to the slaves so that it can basically be more fuel for the fire to abolish this horrific institution of chattel slavery here in the Americas. So I want to thank you for tuning in and sticking with us for 16 parts of 50 years in chains. Whew, that was wild. I think the history that I picked up from this, there's a lot of history, but in the latter portion, they said that the selling of slaves to the South, when the South began to get into the cotton production, they said it was a bigger stealing away of slaves than it was coming out of Africa. So, and I heard that somewhere. I don't know the fullness of it, but the point of the matter being that many, as you hear him say, many were being illegally kidnapped. And because by this time, slavery, 1807 in America, slavery was no longer, you couldn't import any new slaves. So A, they were breeding, and B, they were stealing people. So this is not the only story of people being stolen to go and work these plantations. So now they were, it was bootlegging. They were on the black market, so to say. They were stolen in the first place, and they were stolen again. I think I'm gonna look it up. I think it's called the Second Exodus, if I'm not mistaken, as it relates to them stealing slaves and selling them down into the deep South, Louisiana, Georgia, these places. And I just was looking today at some of those plantations that they were building down there. It's beyond our scope of just even looking at it. Some of this stuff is still there. People are visiting, paying money to visit these old plantation houses. It's wild. So it's definitely a deep, rich history, and there's a lot of healing between these pages. So I hope you, I don't even want to say enjoy, because it's not something to enjoy. I hope you were able to learn something from this experience, from his experience, and join us again tomorrow on the 1st of February as we work our way through Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Once again, my name is Amuna Yisrael. This is the LEV Project, coming to you from Take Time to Heal, as well as Solonomics 101. Everybody have a blessed night. Shalom.